I think we're ready? Okay. The Rules Committee will come to order. Last Thursday, on the order of President Trump, the United States mounted a lethal drone attack on Iraqi soil that killed Iranian General Soleimani. According to the outgoing Prime Minister, this strike was carried out without Iraqi permission or knowledge. More troubling still, President Trump didn't even consult Congress beforehand. Last night, Iran launched more than a dozen missiles in response, striking 2 military bases in Iraq used by coalition and U.S. forces. More than 4,000 members of the armed forces, the people we all represent, are now being sent to the Persian Gulf, all without any input from the People's Chamber. I'm glad that the United States and Iran have now taken a step back from the brink of war, but I still didn't hear a plan from the President in his remarks this morning. I'm not convinced, even after the administration's briefing today, that it has any idea of what comes next. Taking a breath is a good thing. I pray we don't have another war in the Middle East. We need to end these costly, endless wars, not creating new ones. But the world is less safe because of the President's chaotic foreign policy, and his actions will have repercussions across the region and the world. This is no time for us to sit on the sidelines. Congress shouldn't be an afterthought. The Constitution is crystal clear. The President may be Commander-in-Chief, but only Congress has the power to declare war. We are a voice for the troops being deployed. We are the voice for their families who are worried sick that as loved ones receive deployment orders. And we are the voice for our constituents who are living in fear of what comes next. That's why this majority is acting today on this resolution. It makes it clear to the administration that Congress needs to authorize any additional hostilities with Iran. Matters of war and peace were never meant to be decided solely by a president holed up in the Oval Office. That's true not just for President Trump, but for any president. I hope my Republican colleagues will do what's right and join us, because no matter what you think of the president's decisions to strike Soleimani, and I know that there are differing opinions, we should all agree that Congress has a role to play here. Democrats don't want war with Iran. I don't believe most Republicans want war with Iran. And the American people certainly don't want a war with Iran. Having said that, I welcome our two distinguished chair and ranking member, but before I turn to them, I want to turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Our hearing today is on an emergency item arising under the War Powers Resolution concerning Iran. As the committee is aware, I've long been supportive of Congress exercising its authority with respect to war powers. As a matter of fact, I've had the opportunity to work with my good friend, the chairman, on a number of occasions. I'm a firm believer that Congress has a role in committing America's military to battle. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 states clearly that the President cannot commit the United States to an armed conflict without the consent of the United States Congress. This is a debate we should have in Congress. I'm glad that my friends on the other side are now interested in debating the issue of congressional authority. They were certainly unwilling to stand up to President Obama's significant intervention in the Libyan civil war. I note that in contrast to President Obama's lengthy intervention, the action President Trump took was limited and designed to neutralize a dangerous individual who had been designated as a terrorist for the last 13 years. Nonetheless, with today's resolution, I believe the majority is putting the proverbial cart before the horse. The resolution today arises following last week's action in which the United States Armed Forces killed Qasem Soleimani, an Iranian general and terrorist leader responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans and the wounding of thousands of more. It also follows last night's event in which Iran fired more than a dozen missiles at U.S. military facilities inside Iraq, and President Trump's speech to the nation this morning on this action. The Department of Defense has said that it struck Soleimani in response to active plans to attack American diplomats and service members in Iraq and in the Middle East. The President very clearly has the legal authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to use defensive military force in response to immediate threats to American personnel, even in the absence of congressional approval. Mr. Chairman, earlier today, members received a classified briefing on the President's action. Yet the fact that we would be holding a hearing on this resolution was announced in the press long before that briefing was held. Further, the House Foreign Affairs Committee is planning to hold a hearing on this very issue next Tuesday, well after we have already considered this resolution. Discussing this resolution before receiving that briefing and before we have all the facts strikes me as premature, particularly given the developments last night and this morning. I also note that when Speaker Pelosi announced we would be considering this resolution, she did so only in a Dear Colleague letter to Democrats. She then sent an updated letter to only Democrats. Surely, if anything should be bipartisan, it should be a topic as serious as war powers. Announcing such a resolution to only one party is hardly a bipartisan approach to this important issue, and further evidence that this is about opposition to the president rather than being an exercise in congressional authority. The resolution is also premature for another reason. The War Powers Resolution clearly lays out a procedure for considering a resolution to direct the president to remove American forces engaged in combat. That procedure requires a referral to the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which then must report a measure out within 15 calendar days. In total, entire congressional consideration of this important issue, including a potential conference committee, could be completed within 42 days. Simply put, in moving forward now with this resolution at the Rules Committee, we're skipping that important committee process. This is not regular order, Mr. Chairman. We should have a debate on authorizing military force. We should have a debate on committing the American military to an armed conflict. We cannot have that debate if we skip regular order and push ahead blindly to the vote. And we cannot have this debate until we have all the facts. But that's not what the resolution before us today is about. Today's resolution is about whether the president has the authority to protect Americans in light of clear evidence of an impending attack. The president not only has that authority, he has that duty. It's worth noting here the sequence of events. We've had a series of Iranian actions, first aimed at ships in the Gulf, then aimed at an attack on oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, then multiple rocket attacks on American forces inside of Iraq by Shia militias aligned with the Iranian government. It only was when an American was killed, American soldiers were wounded, and Mr. General Soleimani was frankly violating UN resolution by being in Iraq in the first place, that the president felt compelled to act. So again, I think we're moving much too rapidly, and I think, Mr. Chairman, we're going to lose the possibility of bipartisan cooperation on an issue where I know you and I have a great deal of common ground and have worked together in the past, and frankly, I hope have the opportunity to work together again in the future. So again, I think we're premature and hasty here, but with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the gentleman's comments. And I also appreciate the fact that over the years, he and some others on this committee have raised alarm bells, both when we've had Republican presidents and Democratic presidents on their willingness to bypass Congress when it comes to declaring emergencies or deploying troops into hostilities without consulting or without getting approval from Congress. And I know my colleagues feel as I do that relying on old AUMFs from 2002 and 2001 to govern how we're going to proceed in future activities, where there's conflict is ridiculous. We could, 100 years from now, people will be justifying getting involved in wars based on a 2002, 2001 AUMF. That is just crazy. But we're not debating an AUMF today. We ought to debate an AUMF as we move forward on some of these matters. This simply is a reaffirmation that, that Congress has a role. If this president or any president wants to go to war with Iran or anyone else, they need to come to Congress for our approval. And I would just say one final thing. One of the things we're going to do, and I think we've talked to you about this, is, we have a committee on expedited procedures here on the Rules Committee, a subcommittee, and we're going to start doing a series of hearings on these matters, not only with regard to war powers, but with regard to declaring emergencies and what is the proper role of Congress. And my hope is that through a series of thoughtful hearings that we will come up with bipartisan legislation, maybe a McGovern-Cole bill or even a Cole-McGovern bill might not be bad. Because these are serious matters that, quite frankly, transcend this administration. It's all administrations. But anyway, having said that, I want to welcome our witnesses who are here to provide testimony in H-Con Res 83, directing the President pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution to terminate the use of United States Armed Forces to engage in hostilities in or against Iran. Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall, we're delighted that you are here with us. Anything you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. I would now like to recognize the distinguished Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Engel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee, thank you. Earlier this afternoon, many of us attended a classified briefing on the crisis with Iran. And let me say at the outset that the world is a better place without Qasem Soleimani in it. He was the architect of so much violence and suffering. He had American blood on his hands. But in foreign policy, we have to weigh all the factors and potential consequences of an action such as the strike that took out Soleimani. So at the briefing, I was listening closely for two major issues. One, was there really sufficient evidence to justify the strike? And two, does the administration have a coherent strategy going forward? I can't publicly get into specifics of what was discussed in this classified setting, of course, but I can say that I wasn't satisfied on either count. Boil it down, and the message from the administration officials was simply, trust us. And that's a problem for me, Mr. Chairman. Trust us is not enough. I think the actions over the last week have been reckless and have jeopardized our security rather than enhancing it. Furthermore, it's not the job of Congress to give any administration its blind trust and say, do whatever you want, particularly when it comes to war powers. The Constitution entrusts the Congress with the authority to declare war, and the American people do not want another war. It is a relief that both the Iranian regime and the Trump administration seem to have opted for de-escalation for the moment, but this could flare up again in the blink of an eye. The Iranians are out to cause trouble. They've already retaliated and may do so again, and we could find this situation spiraling out of control depending on how the administration reacts. We have a responsibility, Mr. Chairman, to make sure that this administration does not plunge our country into another ill-advised war, which is why we need to adopt Representative Slotkin's resolution. We need to state clearly that the President does not have the authority to go to war with Iran. We may hear the administration allege that the 2002 authorization for the use of military force, which we know as the Iraq War Resolution, somehow justifies military action against the Iranians. That's just wrong. I was there in 2002. That is not what Congress intended with that authorization, and we cannot allow it to be used as a blank check. If the administration wants to use military force against Iran, then they must come to Congress first. This measure would direct the President to terminate the use of armed force against Iran without congressional authorization unless it's necessary to respond to an imminent armed attack against the United States. Again, I repeat, an imminent armed attack, not something that might happen sometime in the future. Under the Constitution, the President always has the power to defend America. We all believe in defending America, so this resolution explicitly preserves this right. But it also makes clear that this is a limited exception and the President should not abuse it. Mr. Chairman, no one is going to mistake me for an apologist for Iran. Iran is the world's most prolific state sponsor of terrorism. Iran is going to continue a policy of provocation and destabilization. But we have to think about the consequences for our national security if we pursue a tit-for-tat policy every time Iran does something we don't like. Take Iraq, for example. We have a real security interest in maintaining our partnership with the Iraqis in the fight against ISIS. After the last week, our position there is precarious. It's going to be very difficult for our diplomats and service members to do their jobs and continue the counter-ISIS campaign. That's a consequence we've already seen, and we can all imagine much worse. the United States being dragged yet into another war in the Middle East, putting more brave young Americans in harm's way after everything we've witnessed in the last 20 years. America doesn't want that fight, Mr. Chairman. We don't want to see our country mired in endless war. We owe it to future generations to do all we can to prevent that from happening. So we need to dial this situation back. We need to exert American leadership, responsible American leadership, working with partners to pressure the regime in Tehran and keep them in check. I have serious doubts that the administration has a strategy that will accomplish that. So Congress needs to step in an exercise to exercise our constitutional responsibilities. That starts with adopting this resolution. I'm grateful for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member McCall, welcome.
Thank
Nice to
you.
see you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cole. And I really welcome this discussion. I think you're correct. Matters of war and peace deserve debate in the Congress. Our Article I authorities, I think we all take this seriously. I do agree with Ranking Member Cole. This is a bit of a premature exercise. We have a hearing next week on foreign affairs. We haven't even had one hearing or a markup of the resolution. I think something, if it's that serious, we go through that regular order. In addition, it's a non-binding resolution, so it will never have any force and effect of law. It's just purely a statement to be made by the House. And I recall back when President Obama took down Osama bin Laden, Republican members joined our colleagues on the other side of the aisle and praised the president as Americans first. Unfortunately, today I don't see that happening, and I don't see the president getting credit where I believe it's due, and I believe that this could embolden our enemy. Given the past 24 hours, I'm quite frankly, I just got this in our office an hour ago, was a little disappointed. I think at this point in time, as our forces are under attack by ballistic missiles from Iran, and Mr. Engel and I agree on 95% when it comes to Israel and Iran. We should be coming together as a nation, not portraying American discord and playing politics with our national security. This morning, the president laid out a measured response to Iran's ballistic missile attacks last night. And as we have known ever since he declined to mount a kinetic response to Iran's downing of U.S. drone in international airspace, the president is clearly not seeking war with Iran. I have a particularly keen insight because I've been in the White House many times during these discussions. I was there when he discussed, should we take out their surface-to-air missile site? What is your response? And instead of responding like most people thought, he took a step back and he was very restrained. And I think that's an important point to make because since last October, we've seen a continued escalation and provocation from Iran. I think we're ignoring the assessments of intelligence and military professionals. In getting to Soleimani, I was a counterterrorism federal prosecutor. He is one of the most dangerous terrorists that we knew. He was involved in the Iranian plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States on American soil. He oversaw Iran's support for Assad in Syria, including recruitment of foreign fighters for Assad. He brought the Russians into Syria. He played a key role in the crackdown on protesters in Iran that killed hundreds of Iraqis. And it should be clear to any reasonable person that Soleimani posed a long-term threat to the United States and to innocent civilians throughout the Middle East. For the last 2 decades, he was, in my judgment, the biggest terror threat in the region. According to the Department of Defense, in the last 2.5 months, Soleimani and his proxies launched 12 strikes against U.S. forces and facilities in Iraq. And on December 27th, Iranian proxies killed an American and injured 4 U.S. servicemen near Kirkuk. On December 31st, Iranian proxies launched a fiery direct assault on the United States Embassy in Baghdad. But Soleimani wasn't done. As Secretary Pompeo has said, He was actively plotting to take action that would put dozens, if not hundreds, of U.S. lives at risk, as we heard at our threat briefing today. And DOD went further, saying the attack targeted American diplomats and service members in Iraq and throughout the region. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, said the administration would have been culpably negligent if they had not acted against Soleimani. In my judgment, under the Constitution, the president possesses the legal authority for this strike and complied with their reporting obligations under the War Powers Resolution, giving us notification within 48 hours. He has inherent authority under Article 2 as the commander-in-chief to defend the United States personnel from the attacks that Soleimani was carrying out and still plotting against Americans. And people say, why did he choose to do this at this time? Because our embassy was attacked. Because there was an imminent threat to Americans, both military and diplomats. Even Jay Johnson, a guy I got to work with very closely as Secretary of Homeland Security, who was the Department of Defense's legal counsel who authorized airstrikes under the Obama administration, said that Soleimani was a lawful military objective. And the president, under his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief, had ample domestic legal authority to take him out without additional congressional authorization. As a second additional authority, the National Security Advisor cited the 2002 AUMF that authorized the use of force. And Mr. Chairman, we can debate whether we need to modernize and update this AUMF. I would say that a lot of Republicans would be open to this idea, but that's not what this resolution does. The AUMF in 2002, quote, to defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq. That authorization has been used previously to address terrorists, threats to the United States personnel inside Iraq, namely ISIS. It's important to point out that Mr. Soleimani was designated as a terrorist by the United States. For example, the Obama administration also cited it as an authority to go after ISIS. But I believe this partisan reaction to last week's single strike in defense of Americans are even more apparent when compared to the reactions to President Obama's thousands of unauthorized airstrikes in defense of Libya, inside Libya, in 2011. Back in June of 2011, then Leader Pelosi was asked about the Obama administration's months of airstrikes inside country, dropping hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. munitions without congressional authorization. I'm not saying one wrong makes right? We have to get this right, the Congress. But Leader Pelosi, when asked, said, Madam Leader, you're asking or saying that the president did not need additional authorization and still does not need any authorization from Congress on Libya. Her answer was, quote, yes, I believe the limited nature of this engagement allows the president to go forward. I'm satisfied the president has the authority he needs to go ahead. That logic should apply with far more to the strike against Soleimani to protect Americans. And I'm glad the administration did not hesitate to take bold action given the level of the threat. Soleimani showed us through the embassy attack and the attacks on U.S. forces that he was serious about harming Americans. Our intelligence community saw his next plan coming together, and our military, under the direction from our president, acted. I thank the president and the men and women of our intelligence community and military for upholding their responsibility to protect American lives. I've been with the president on many occasions on this. He's very clear he does not want war, does not want to start a new war. He wants to wind down the endless wars. He wants to reduce our footprint. He said, and he says today, he wants to make peace with Iran. He wants to see a vibrant, prosperous Iran. His tone today was one of de-escalation, and I'm glad to hear that. None of us in this room want to see an escalation with Iran. And I think that a policy of de-escalation and calling upon our NATO allies to exercise diplomatic channels, in my judgment, is the best step forward. And I think the president's making that choice to move toward the ladder of de-escalation. I'm concerned, instead of supporting the president, that though this resolution could embolden Iran and see Americans divided on the issue rather than united against what I consider, and many justifiably so, as the largest state sponsor of terror. With that, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. And let me just say a couple of things. First of all, I appreciate both of your being here today. I appreciate your testimony. And I think, there is a divide in this country in terms of reaction to what the president did. It's not because anybody, in any way, shape, or form, at all, supported or somehow excused or didn't think it was serious, the crimes that Soleimani committed over the years, crimes against our own members of our armed forces. He was a bad player. There's no two ways about it. I mean, no matter how you want to describe it. And but previous administrations, not just the Obama administration, but the Bush administration, the Israelis as well, have all contemplated this idea of whether or not it would be wise to take him out, and opted not to because they thought that the consequences, the repercussions, would far outweigh any benefits by killing him. And as we gather here today, I mean, a few weeks ago, you saw dissent in the streets of Tehran where Iranians were divided and protesting against their government. And now we see Iranians united in a way that we've never seen before. Iraq, which is our ally, their parliament votes to ask our troops to leave the country. We have Iran now pledging to pursue a nuclear weapon. We have thousands and thousands of new deployments in the Middle East. I mean, this notion that somehow we're all more secure today because of this, I mean, I think is debatable, and I would argue with you that we're not. But that's not what this resolution is about. The president did what he did, and people can come to their own conclusions about whether they support him or not. This is about whether or not, if we expand hostilities, whether or not Congress has a role in that. And, I have no idea what the circumstances will be if we debated an AUMF or a declaration of war on Iran. I don't support it, but I don't know where everybody is on that. But the bottom line is people should have that vote. And if you want to go to war, you ought to vote yes. If you don't want to go to war, you ought to vote no. And this is not just an indictment of this administration. It's previous administrations as well. They have gotten so used to, in my opinion, abusing, an old AUMF that they feel that Congress is essentially an afterthought. We don't have to debate these issues in Congress. And I think that that's a mistake. I think the idea that it is 2020 and we are relying on an authorization from 18 years ago to justify what we're doing against Iran, I think it's just ludicrous. I think it's such a disservice to our troops and to their families. I mean, I've had a number of parents call me whose kids are being deployed, who are sick out of their minds, wondering what's going on here. And why aren't you debating this? And why aren't you talking about this? And, what are the pros and the cons? And, this is all just happening. And when you say to them, well, the president says he has the authority under 2002 or 2001 AUMF, they're like, that's 18, 19 years ago. So we all collectively here, are to blame for not taking this issue up a lot sooner. And either eliminating those old AUMFs and debating new ones. And by the way, if we can't come to a consensus on an AUMF, then we ought not to be sending troops into harm's way. It's that simple. But this is about whether or not, if hostilities continue, whether or not we have a role. And I think we do. I think it's there in the Constitution. And I think this, no matter what you think about what the president just did, I think we all ought to agree that we ought to have a debate and a vote on this. Anyway, having said that, I yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma.
I think you already have, but just let me respond quickly. I've done that. Would you like There's a big, big difference between going into Libya, where I would agree with you, we should have had that debate, and what happened where Soleimani. We don't need an AUMF to take out somebody. The president has those powers under Article 2. It's plain and simple. If there's an immediate danger, and we have a whole series of events where, frankly, I agree with my friend, the ranking member, this president has shown enormous forbearance. This is not something he wants. This is not somebody that's planning a war. This is somebody that literally, when ships were attacked in the Gulf, did not rush off and do something. This is somebody that when an ally of the United States had the vital facility struck, Saudi Arabia, did not do anything other than send defensive capability to Saudi Arabia to try and help it. This is somebody that when a drone was shot down and his own military advisors were recommending a strike, said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to risk human life. It's only when an American, after multiple attacks, on American facilities, where, by the way, we were indirectly allied with the Iranians against ISIS. They're attacking us while we're fighting a common enemy, for goodness sake. Americans killed, Americans are wounded, and the idea that the President of the United States can't respond, to me, just doesn't stand scrutiny at all. So if we are talking about a major war, I would agree with you. That's not what happened here. And frankly, if we're going to have this debate and it's going to be serious, then it needs to have started in Chairman's committee. We should have had a markup. We should have a full. That's not what's going on. This is a political exercise. This is almost a reflexive reaction as opposed to thoughtful consideration. And I think it will divide us rather than unite us. It will make it partisan rather than bipartisan. I look forward to working with you because I know you're serious about this, and we've worked together in the past, and you are absolutely right about reclaiming the appropriate powers of Congress. That's not what's going on here. This is an effort to try and score political points against the president, who, by the way, has been extraordinarily restrained throughout his 3 years in the use of military force. We use military force a lot more frequently under President Obama without consultation to Congress than we have under this president. So I think in this case, he did do the right thing. I think he's right to say this should have happened a long time ago. Republicans and Democrats missed opportunities to do this. I'm not so sure the Israelis did. I think they came and talked to us. We told them not to do it. I think they would have probably been a little bit more decisive. But I don't want to send the wrong message here. I don't want to send the message that the president somehow did something wrong when he took out a terrorist who's killed hundreds of Americans. Every single one of us in Congress represent constituents who've lost limbs because of General Soleimani's actions and what he did. And this isn't a guy who just was doing the wrong thing for the last few weeks or the last few months. This is a matter of years and decades of systematic terrorism by this guy, and we all agree on that. There's no debate about that. Frankly, I think he'd gotten so used to acting with impunity that he exposed himself. He had no business being in Iraq in the first place. He literally was violating a UN resolution to be there. And if anybody thinks he was on a vacation to Baghdad, I don't think that's what was going on. I think he was there consulting with the enemies of the United States about how to kill Americans, damage American interests. So I think the president was well within his constitutional authority here. But if we want to have this discussion, we should do it the right way. It should start in committee with a markup, a full discussion, a full hearing. You should be calling witnesses from the administration as to their justification as to why they did this. I have no objection to that at all. This was a resolution basically written in the Speaker's office. We got it, 45 minutes ago, an hour ago. That's not what we're talking about. This is much more political than it is about constitutional authority and the appropriate balance of power. And that's a disservice because we're going to end up with a partisan vote on a partisan resolution that is going to paper over, the fact that we're ignoring a terrorist. We're being critical, I think, indirectly of the president, implying that he wanted to plot war with Iran. Anything but. This is a guy that turned the cheek multiple times before, but he did say, you kill an American, it's going to be very different. And that's exactly what happened here. And then he responded decisively. I think it's a pretty important message. Now, we can debate the nuances of the Iranian response or whether we're drifting toward war. I think we're further away from war because the president laid down a pretty clear marker here and said you're not going to be able to kill Americans with impunity and us not respond. So, again, I look forward to discussion. And again, let me say up front, Mr. Chairman, I'm a little passionate about this. I don't doubt anybody, let alone your sincerity on this issue. Not for 1 minute. I think everybody on this dais, and I know our two friends that are appearing here as witnesses today, all believe that congressional war-making authority needs to be reclaimed. It's eroded over many, many years under presidents of both parties. That's something we ought to be doing and working on together, and I know we will. So, but I just think in this instance, the president was so right to act and had every justification, and we shouldn't be raising this particular matter in connection with him taking out a terrorist who had killed so many Americans, had wounded thousands more, and goodness knows how many Muslims have been killed by this guy, a lot more than Americans. This was a bad actor, and the president was right to do what he did. I'm sorry we as a country didn't act earlier under both Republicans and Democrats. I cast no aspersions to my friends on that. I think both of us, both parties have been, or administrations of both parties have made that mistake. But this was the right thing to do. This was the right time to do it. They didn't have a lot of time to act. I think the president chose the moment, acted decisively, and we're all safer for it. But yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My good friend from Oklahoma makes, as usual, a very, very compelling argument that I disagree with. And I disagree for the reason that if the president had enough time to tell Republicans and people in Mar-a-Lago that something big was about to happen, then he had ample time, in my judgment, to tell the Gang of Eight, at the very least, here in Congress, which was not done. But I'll pass on that. I do want to correct the record on President Obama. President Obama did seek at one point to have a new authorization, and it was kind of interesting because it was awkward because at the very same time he was arguing that he had the authority to do what he was doing. But for our witnesses, I have a question. And let me start with Mr. McCall. Do you believe that Iran is through attacking the United States and our allies?
We can probably anticipate another response. However, what I find interesting about this attack is that there were no casualties. They launched 15 ballistic missiles, caused infrastructure damage, not one casualty. Yet inside Iran, a propaganda war rages, inflating the people. So they accomplished their mission to tell their people they did something to strike the Americans. Mm-hmm. Yet at the same time, they didn't kill Americans. So in a way, they got it both ways, which signals to me, and I can tell you from what the briefings I've had from the back channeling, is that I think the Secretary talked a little bit about it today. I don't want to get into classified, but I do think that everybody's taken a step back and taken a deep breath and looking at the de-escalation, because now Iran knows that this president will hit them. And I think that has a deterrent effect, because if your weakness invites aggression, and time again, they were provocative and they were hitting us time and time again when the military and members of Congress who were hawkish were telling them to respond, and he said, I'm really not going to respond. But imagine this, Mr. Chairman, our embassy's attacked and Americans killed, 4 wounded soldiers, and an imminent plot to kill Americans. If the president had done nothing in that light of that, and the imminent plot did go forward, Soleimani goes back to Tehran, reports to the Ayatollah, green light's given, and hundreds of servicemen and diplomats are killed, and he did nothing, Imagine the fallout from that.
Well, tell me this, what would happen if Iran killed Milley? What would we do?
Well, I mean, he's not designated as a terrorist.
Whether he is or is not. If they kill the Joint Chief of Staff, I believe that we would take action, and I believe we would have every reason to do so. It's an interesting proposition that we
But
are
to
confronted
compare
with.
General Milley to Soleimani, with all due
But
respect, is
no,
an unfair
just the
comparison.
position.
Okay.
General Milley is holding the top military position. Soleimani, who, and let me make it very clear, I don't care whether he's dead, no more than anybody. Everybody that has made that argument understands that this guy was a bad actor. But when President Trump stands up and says he should have been gone a long time ago, well, hell, he's been president for 3 years. And Soleimani hadn't gone anywhere. Mike, I served on the Intelligence Committee, and we were talking about Soleimani, and I'm talking 15 years ago. So there's nothing particularly new that takes place, and I'm concerned about whether or not there was anything any more imminent than what he had been doing all along. But let me give Mr. Engel a chance to answer the same question. Do you believe that Iran is finished attacking the United States and our allies?
No, I don't. As I said before, what I'm doing has nothing to do with my liking in any way of the regime in Tehran. I think it's a brutal regime, and I think that the people of Iran deserve better.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I think the people of Iran deserve better than the thugs that are in power now. But frankly, I've been here a while. I voted to support some of the wars, and I'm frankly tired of endless war. I mean, I think that that's what we do. And every president in both parties has come to us and said, you know, in a sense, trust me. And here we are going back to a 2002 AUMF. When does it end? And when do we ever break away, except to simply break away and say no more? So I think we're in a, you know, there's people who feel very strongly that this just sucks us into endless war. And I think Iran will do whatever it decides to do based on its own facts. And we're likely to have a confrontation with them again. They're not going to overnight become this good government country. I feel sorry for the Iranian people, frankly, because they're good people, but they're caught with this terrible regime. So yeah, I do think that they will strike us again. And I think that if we play tit for tat with them, we're the fools.
Let me tell you why, and I'll make a prediction, and then I'll move on because there's so many members that need to say things. For all the while that I'm here, the War Powers Act has been a discussion. President Roosevelt, when Japan attacked us in Hawaii, spoke about them doing it suddenly and deliberately. But he had time to call this body in to discuss whether or not to go to war. And I'm from that generation, and it's easy for me to understand that. Now let me leave both of you and the rest of my colleagues with something to think about, and I'll make this prediction. Ayatollah Khomeini, day before yesterday, appointed Ismail Ghani to replace Soleimani. Ismail Ghani, if you look at his biography, was the operational guy for Soleimani. Soleimani was the pretty face taking selfies, rolling around, and probably having himself a very good time killing our people and ordering same. But trust me when I tell you that Ismail Ghani, who joined the Quds Force roughly about the same time that the gentleman that was just killed, they were both very active on the battlefield. And remember the words operational. And that's what Ismail Ghani is. And that's why I say they're nowhere near finished attacking us. Mr. Woodall.
I think the chairman, I wanted to ask Mr. McCall, you're opposed to this resolution?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I was listening carefully to the chairman's opening statement. He asked the question, if we expand hostilities, does Congress have a role in that? I would say that's emphatically yes. Do you have a position that Congress doesn't have an Article I responsibility?
No, in fact, at the outset, I believe in the Article I, authority of Congress to declare war, or as we've done recently, the authorized use of military force. Engaging in hostilities with Iran. If the administration, let's say, for instance, he's going to be given a myriad of options, the president. One option could be, we're going to strike the surface-to-air missile sites out of Iran that fired these ballistic missiles into Iraq at our military bases. That would trigger, in my judgment, what happened with Soleimani triggered the War Powers Act for notification purposes, but in terms of an AUMF, that, in my judgment, would be the line crossed, and we should have that debate in Congress. And I completely agree with you, Mr. Chairman. We have the power to declare war, and we haven't done it since Roosevelt. But it's engaging in hostilities against Iran. Taking out a terrorist like Obama did with ISIS in Iraq, I don't think triggers that.
Help me to understand, then, Mr. Chairman. Is so important to move rapidly and says any concurrent resolution introduced pursuant to Section 5C shall be referred to the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the House of Representatives or the Committee on Foreign Relations of the Senate, and such concurrent resolution shall be reported out by such continue. In this case, I've got hostilities that have stopped, and I've got a committee that hasn't met. We share the goal of preventing administrations from putting men and women in harm's way without not just congressional approval, but congressional engagement and enthusiastic participation. Are we missing an opportunity again to do this together? I just don't understand how either we as an Article I institution or you all as the Committee of Jurisdiction are advantaged by moving a resolution that was drafted an hour ago instead of doing exactly what we anticipated, which is having the thoughtful debate, the debate that Chairman McGovern's constituents, the parents of the men and women who were killed overseas are asking for. How are we advantaged as an institution or as a committee by moving this resolution in this way?
Well, I would say you make some excellent points, but to me, the overriding point to make is that, once again, we are plunging into an endless war, and we could wait a week or wait 2 weeks. I don't think the situation or the arguments change one way or another. You know, I have voted for the wars. I have voted for all the wars. I regret it very, very much in looking back at what's happened. I regret it because what we've bought ourselves is, again, endless war. It isn't just a war that's justified because the other country is doing bad things. The other countries were doing bad things, as is the leadership in Iran. But I just think that I feel very strongly and more strongly as I've been here that we are a co-equal branch of government and we ought to act like it. And any administration, I don't care what the party is, who doesn't grant us our rights that we have by the Constitution should not be given a blank check. And I think that's the situation here, as was the situation in other administrations. So we could wait, but I don't really see what that gets us. I think the time to talk about this is now, because we don't want another generation, you know, sucked into endless war.
I don't want to put words in the ranking member's mouth, but I certainly know he's not here to make news today, but what I thought I just heard him say is, right now we have hostilities that have ended. If the administration decides tomorrow to attack facilities within the borders of Iran, it would absolutely require that we come together as an institution and either authorize it or that he get out. It seems to me that only one of two things is true. Either the hostilities have ended and thus there is no need for this resolution, or hostilities are going to continue exactly as you predict, and yet in that event, you would then have a bipartisan partnership in the entire leadership of your committee that would then lead to a much different vote. And if we're really serious about reclaiming Article I powers, and more importantly, protecting the American people, the House speaking in a divided partisan voice is worth nothing in that respect. The House speaking in a single unanimous voice is worth an enormous amount in that respect, and it seems like we do have that opportunity as just enunciated by the ranking member.
Well, let me just say, and Mr. McCall, I know will agree with me because we have talked about this many, many times. We pride ourselves on the Foreign Affairs Committee as being the most bipartisan committee in the entire Congress, because we believe that partisanship should stop at the water's edge, that when it comes to protecting Americans, that the differences that we have are very minor compared to our similarities. We're all Americans. We all love this country. We all care about this country. We all care about its people. And so I don't believe if we wait 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or whatever it is, things are essentially going to change. We once again have a situation where a president of the United States is trying to bypass Congress to get us back into what seems to me like endless war. And I'm saying it as one who, for the first time, is really opposing this. I've again, voted for under Bush. I voted for whenever it was there before. I voted for it. But I feel that if we don't put a stop to it now, it'll never end. It won't end 2 weeks from now. It won't end a month from now. It won't end at all. I think now's the time to do it. And I hope we can do it and reassert ourselves. The American people, I think, want us to assert ourselves. We're representing them, after all. And I just think that what's gone on in the past several weeks, whether it's stopped permanently, which I hope, or temporarily, I don't think that it sends the message to this administration, this president, and future presidents of both parties that Congress is going to reclaim its constitutional role.
Well, ordinarily, I read the committee report. Benefit of being on the Rules Committee, we get the very best leaders from the committees who come before us, and we get the committee report that has all the information. And this probably would have been answered had there been a hearing, and I'm not a foreign affairs expert, but Section 1 says termination of the use of United States Armed Forces to engage in hostilities in Iran. I'm unaware of any use of armed forces to engage in hostilities in Iran. And to suggest that my Article I powers are going to be expanded by telling the president he can't do something that he's not doing is one of the things that frustrates me about this measure. I want to be your partner. I agree with everything that you've said about the way that you lead the committee, the way that the committee has been led in a bipartisan way, and the ability that we have to make very powerful statements together. President Clinton reflects on the opportunities that he had to deal with Osama bin Laden, and he had advisors who said, do it. He had advisors who said, don't do it. And time again, in that debate, he chose don't do it, and we've heard the regret that he's expressed in the years intervening. If all we're talking about here today is the very big deal of an American president going after a known terrorist who has a history of killing Americans, so be it. But if what we're talking about is an American president taking America into a new war, we would not have the resolution introduced 60 minutes before the ranking member gets a chance to see it. We wouldn't have a resolution coming to the Rules Committee. We've got new rules in the Rules Committee where folks have to send bills through a regular order process. We have hearings and markups on bills to change the time and place that organizational activities at the Department of Agriculture take place. And yet something as serious, a committee that handles only serious issues, shows up inside of an hour. I share all of your goals, keeping us out of endless wars, reclaiming Article I power, and most importantly, speaking with a united voice on foreign affairs, because America is not advantaged when our foes see America divided. I just don't understand how this resolution gets it, and candidly, I'm not going to ask you to defend it, because, again, I know your track record, and I know your expertise and your love of the country, and I don't, this probably should be left not to policy matter experts to defend, but political experts to defend. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you both for being here. I have a lot of great respect for both of you. I served on Foreign Affairs Committee. Truly enjoyed my bipartisan time there. Can't believe I left that committee for rules. And I obviously, I served with you under your chairmanship in Homeland Security. So I want to talk to both of you as a mother of a veteran. My heart right now is breaking for every military family out there who is calling and reaching out, who is frankly on pins and needles because they don't know what is happening. And as a member of Congress, on my salary, I can't afford to go to Mar-a-Lago to get a briefing from, the president. I really can't. As a member of Congress, I can't take a gift valued at more than $10. So I can't have somebody else pay for me to go to Mar-a-Lago to, dine with the president.
I've never been there, for the record.
Well, thank you for saying that, because I was going to ask you, I kind of would have felt better if you had said, I was there and I was briefed, and I can look at you in the eye and reassure you that the president made the right call. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that. I want to be able to trust that a decision was made based on factual information, that my son's life, my children are a little too old to serve and to be recalled back, but that my constituents' blood matters and that is worth something, and that as their representative, I'm able to reassure them that we made the right decision. But the president said that his Twitter feed serves as a proper notification to Congress. That's nothing to, joke about. We can't discuss the power of sending our sons and daughters to war over Twitter. We can't have that debate. We were in a classified briefing earlier, and we were told you cannot talk about anything that is discussed here, even if it's already out there in open source. So how can the president make a decision like this on the golf course? How can members of the rich, elitists, or elite, I should say, let me clarify that. I don't want to offend anyone that, can afford to buy ink by the barrel. How can they have more influence to influence the president on a decision to send my constituents to war? It's outrageous to me. Knowing you, and I know that you have to hold a certain position, but this is not about Republicans or Democrats. This is red blood of our sons and daughters. I still don't know what the threat was. What was so dire that the president decided to kill an individual that we all understand and know he is a terrorist, and he is in a place where he may deserve to be right now. I agree with the president wanting to reduce the number of troops. I would agree that I also want to see peace there. I would agree that we should be calling on our NATO allies to help us in this situation. I don't know that he has the diplomacy to do that because of how much he has poked our allies in the eye. I don't know that our allies are confident to stand with us because they don't agree with what action we have taken. So we do know a few things, that since this action was taken by the president, we do know that Iran has launched missiles at our troops. We do know that the Iraqi parliament, a democracy, by the way, that we helped to build up, right? That they have voted to throw us out of the country. We know that there are thousands of our constituents right now being deployed to the region to the tune of approximately 15,000 more than there were 6 months ago, just 6 months ago. So if we want peace in the region, we're sending more troops, we're sending more ammunition. I don't know that we're prepared for that. We all understand that Congress is the check and balance, and that our job is just that, not simply to write a blank check. But the president continues to ignore our position and our accountability. He notified Congress, after the fact. Our leadership was not notified. How would you feel if you were if you were wearing our shoes and you were not notified? How would you feel to hear about it in the news or through a Twitter? And to this day, his rationale remains classified. So the justification is simply to trust President Trump. Trust him. That is a very, very tall order for someone like me who has been listening to over 15,000 lies coming out of the president. How can I trust this decision when you were not even there? You were not even involved in that. Someone that I do trust. We deserve to know what the justification was. Our constituents deserve to know why their sons and daughters are being sent into harm's way. The power to declare war rests with Congress, and Trump is making it crystal clear why the framers of our Constitution wanted it that way. War is about life and death, and we can't forget that. I was a member of the Pomona City Council when we first went to war with Iraq. One of my constituents was one of the first kills there. I can't tell you how difficult it is to deal with that, to talk to their high school friends, to talk to their parents, and to try to tell the media to give the family room to grieve. I can't tell you how difficult it is to be in a meeting, in a public meeting, a crowded public meeting, and have someone bring you an LA Times newspaper. And he was such a proud dad, pointing to his son sitting on a tank in Iraq and saying, "Look, here's my son." We were all happy for him, but we couldn't answer any questions. But I was a city council member. But I also knew that that happiness was short-lived because we understood that that young man was still alive the day that photo was taken. But the following day when he came to my meeting, we didn't know. This is what we have to tell our constituents. Some of us may not have the courage to say we are going to vote for war today or tomorrow, but that is our job. That's why the people elected us to this position. That is not simply left to the president, the billionaires that can afford to go to Mar-a-Lago, and the member of Congress whose job is to bring accountability and transparency is locked out because I can't afford to go there. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Burgess.
Would you like me to respond? to that?
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, and your son is serving, you said, or?
He's out,
Oh,
thank
okay.
goodness, yes.
Well, and thanks for his service. Look, this is emotional. Now, we've all been to the funerals, those of us who've been in Congress during the height of the Iraq conflict, and it is hard. It's tragic. I would only point out that 600 Americans died on the battlefield in Iraq because of Soleimani. Thousands were injured because he was the one putting the IEDs in Iraq to injure American soldiers and to kill them. This decision, I can tell you, was made unanimously by the Joint Chiefs, by the SecDef, by the Secretary of State, by the National Security Advisor, by the National Security Council, and the Vice President. All felt very strongly the threat was so imminent that to do otherwise would be derelict in their duties. On the notification issue, point well taken, a tweet's not, in my judgment, sufficient under the War Powers Act, but we did receive within 48 hours written formal notice, and you've probably read it, it's in the SCIF. It's very short. On the declassification, I publicly made the comments that more should be declassified, because particularly when it comes to members, whether it's classified or not, we need to know more as to the nature of the imminent threat. And I think the administration would be well served to do that. I do think it was, and I do think I know what was happening. I think I know what Soleimani was doing and what was going to happen if we didn't stop him, at that point in time. Notification, Gang of Eight it's a Title 50 enterprise. That's why it's House Intel, as you know, Judge, and leadership. This was a Title 10 operation under DOD. It wouldn't formally trigger the Gang of Eight, although I'm always for consultation with Congress, don't get me wrong. Then finally on the Parliament, that was not good to see, but that only the Shia members showed up, not the Sunnis, not the Kurds, and it was a non-binding resolution that they passed. Not a good sign, I agree with you. But I don't think that's going to change our presence there.
Dr. Burgess. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you. Well, Mr. McCall, on the issue of classified and unclassified, as you gave your opening remarks, you gave probably one of the best recitations that I've heard of the reasons leading up to this decision. So recognizing there are, I know people get home from work and they tune into the Rules Committee, and what they like to do, how they spend their evenings. But let me ask you, if you wouldn't mind, going back to your opening statement and just walk us through again the data that you presented as you began your opening remarks. Could I ask you to do that?
Sure. And Soleimani, and I followed terrorists prior to coming to Congress, and as chairman of Homeland Security, Norm and I served together. And it's quite a timeline, and it goes back 2 decades. And 1979, the Ayatollah presides over a reign of terror in the region, and this guy is the chief architect of terror in the Middle East, killing hundreds of Americans, injuring thousands. In Syria, killing tens of thousands of Muslims in Syria, bringing the Russians in. Lebanon, he was creating what's called the Shia Crescent, which is, as Elliot knows, the land bridge that was going to create a bridge between Iran, Iraq, into Syria, Lebanon, and then Hamas down in Gaza. Remember, Quds means Jerusalem. So Quds Force, and this is the guy who's the commander of the Quds Force, his really primary goal was to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. He's an evil man, an ally of ours, probably one of the few that we have in that area. That's his sole mission. He was very good at assassinations. He conducted assassinations in Europe, hostage takings, all the, we talk a lot about the border, all the drug trade coming out of, what's called the Persian area, into Latin America, up into the United States, counterfeiting, what they call kleptology, so that stealing and killing is what they like to do. I think on our soil, you may remember when the Saudi ambassador was having dinner at Milan Cafe, Milano, and there was a plot that was thwarted, thank God. That was directed by Soleimani. Total support for Assad. Assad being one of the biggest mass murderers, genocide, one of the most evil dictators that we've seen in our lifetime. And Elliot and I have seen evidence of what has happened under Assad with the genocide that's played out there. That's Soleimani. Cracking down on the protesters in Iraq, his own people, killing hundreds of his own people.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, protesters in Iran or Iraq?
I'm sorry, in Iran.
Okay. And this was the gasoline?
No, in Iraq, I'm sorry.
Was this the gasoline subsidy protest?
But also protesters in Iran. So you know what happened in Iran? They shut off the internet, and then they kill. So you can't see it. So they shut down all the communication, and they go in, and then Soleimani and his Quds Force guys, his IRGC guys, come in and start slaughtering. We've seen the videos exported out of Iran. So, yeah, I mean, we're all here to debate whether an AUMF is appropriate, and I think Mr. Woodall made some very good points as to why it's premature. But I have no love loss. I have no remorse for Mr. Soleimani being taken out. And, I know that others will take his place, but I think the world is safer without him.
And Chairman Engel, let me just ask you to disagree with any of the recitation that Ranking Member McCall has just provided for us?
Mike and I, Mr. McCall and I agree on many things, probably on most things. I don't think there's anybody in this Congress or in this room who would make any excuses for Soleimani. Certainly not me. and the world is better off with him not around. But we have a constitution, and the more I'm here, the stronger I feel about it as the years go by. It really, galls me that presidents have felt free to just disregard the Congress, and I think that is wrong. I think part of this is an attempt once more to try to utilize what's written in the Constitution, and that is that Congress has the power to declare war, and that the United States, we are a co-equal branch of government, and it isn't where the executive gets to make all the decisions with no input from Congress. So I don't really, believe that it would matter if we waited 2 weeks or 4 weeks, whatever it is. The bottom line for me is, do we think that the president should continue to be able to send Americans to war without a declaration of war or without any kind of input from the Congress, which by the Constitution has the right to declare war? And that's what upsets me. This is not a debate about whether Soleimani was good. He was awful. And there are other awful people there in Iran. There were terrible demonstrations not just a few weeks ago where I hope that perhaps there'd be some spirit. The Iranian people are good people. We have many Iranian Americans that all of us know. But I just feel very strongly that when it comes to matters of life and death, and I think Ms. Torres spoke eloquently about life and death, I think we are the ones that were given the right by our being elected as members of Congress to declare war and to continue to decide whether or not America goes to war. It should not be done by any president without the consultation of Congress and without the input of Congress. And we've had no input whatsoever.
So, thank you for your answer. Mr. McCall, let me just ask you, you kind of alluded to, again, in your recitation of events leading up to this, times that the president has shown remarkable restraint, taking out a drone, one of our drones. And the advice that he was given by his combatant commanders was, you go get them, because they did this to you. And he called it off at the last minute and said, this was a machine. We're not going to kill people because we lost a machine. And I thought that was a very reasonable and reasoned approach that the president took. And there have been other times. There have been seizures of assets of other countries in the Strait of Hormuz. There have been, goodness knows, we all sat in a State of the Union address in the previous administration when our sailors had been taken captured by Iranians, and the president at the time didn't even offer any sort of reassurance to the families of those sailors who were now captured under an Iranian flag that, hey, we got your back. I thought that would have been important that night, but we didn't get that. I didn't criticize the president at the time, but I thought it would have been great for the families who were experiencing that night. I mean, you got a joint session of Congress, you got the House, the Senate, and all the Joint Chiefs, the diplomatic corps, and the president might have said, bad news out of Iraq today, but not to worry, we've got your back. He could have tweeted it, and I would have been reassured. Look, you and I were both here in 2011 when Osama bin Laden was removed. We're all grateful for that. I wasn't informed before that happened. In fact, the Saturday night before, just exactly like 24 hours before that happened, it was a White House Correspondents' Dinner. We were all down. It's the only one I've ever been invited to. That's why I remember it. It sticks out in my mind. They never asked me back. But we were all sitting there. Secretary Gates was there. I mean, I was, in retrospect, absolutely impressed with the ability for the people who needed to make that decision and the people who needed to know we're sitting at this very festive occasion, but at the same time, this is all sort of percolating in the back of their minds. I didn't care that I wasn't notified that Osama bin Laden was taken out. And you know how I found out that night, that Sunday night, after I came back to Texas, and I'm sitting there at my laptop, and I go on Twitter. I find out on Twitter that Osama bin Laden died. Not because President Obama tweeted it out, not because Secretary Gates tweeted it out, but everyone else on Twitter's talking about how great it is that Osama bin Laden's dead. And he had people down out in front of the White House, chanting USA, USA. It was a happy time that happened. I don't recall anyone being upset that Congress wasn't involved in the decision. And God knows we leak like a damn sieve up here. If you want something to be blasted across the front pages of the paper, come talk to Congress and give us a briefing, because we'll blab about it, and perhaps to the detriment of the people that we've sent in to do the activity that needs to occur. Mr. Hastings referenced that he feels that we're nowhere near the end of people attacking us. I would actually agree with that. I mean, it's a dangerous world. It's going to continue to be a dangerous world. We have to be at our best every single day, as I think we've both heard during our times in our career here. The terrorists just have to be right once. We got to be at our best every single day. So that wasn't going to change whether or not Soleimani was removed. Like you, I've been here through the time that Iraq was at its most kinetic in the Iraq War. Multiple trips over to the theater at the time it was going on. I think I made a total of 11 trips to Iraq. I remember one of the generals in 2007 telling us these explosively formed projectiles, which are now the new thing. We'd had IEDs and then vehicle-borne IEDs, and now we had these explosively formed projectiles. And the general said, and they come from Iran. And I was like, I interrupted him. I said, no, you mean they come from Iraq, not from Iran. He said, no, they come from Iran. How do you know they come from Iran? The wiring, the switches, the timers. It is the signature of a general in Iran that we know is responsible for the manufacture. And these are things that take off like half a person's body when they go off. I mean, these are the most dreadful of the dreadful weapons. So in 2007, it was sort of common knowledge amongst our troops in Iraq that there were bombs being manufactured in Iran and utilized against our American forces. I think that's the reference to the 600 servicemen who've been injured or maimed or killed by these explosively formed projectiles. Like you, Mr. McCall, I thought I was sitting in this chair last night, only 24 hours ago, and you start getting the Twitter, again, tells us that there's missiles landing in the country of Iraq, and oh my God, they're falling all over the place, and this is a bad deal. I was high anxiety at that time. You don't know how that's going to work out. And like you, I thought, well, the next thing will have to be, we will know from our intelligence where those missiles originated, and those places will be obliterated before first light in the morning. Now, it didn't happen. There were no casualties. And again, I think the president exercised significant restraint. You've got, satellite technology, and this is not something we heard in the classified briefing, this is something I read in the New York Times. You've got satellite technology that can tell you where these things took off, what their trajectory was, where they were going, so it was kind of known. So the ability to retaliate to those very sites, I suspect, is something we would be pretty good at. But like you, I thought the next thing I would hear was us taking out the ballistic missile sites, and we didn't do it. The president showed some restraint. He was supposed to go on television last night. He did not do it. I guess the word coming down that there were no casualties or injuries, and the president wisely paused to wait for the total battlefield assessment the next day in the light of day. And then I thought gave a pretty remarkable talk this morning. And I think it was a pretty remarkable talk that actually gave both sides a little bit of what they needed. President can stand down for a while. Iran can stand down for a while. And that's to the benefit of the American people and certainly our fighting forces over there. You know, the president, I realized it was at a rally, but he gave a very significant, I thought, recitation. I was driving home one night listening to it on the radio, and he talked about the dignified transfer that he attended at Dover Air Force Base, and how difficult it was, speaking to some of the same things that we've heard here today. I mean, I think the president feels this very acutely. A lot of us were upset about the president's decision in Syria. We'd never given an authorization for use of military force in Syria. Never was really clear to me how there were so many troops in Syria, and the president made the decision that he's bringing our folks home. And part of the rationale was because the difficulty that he saw at that dignified transfer, where family members were, for the first time, come to the full reality of what has happened and what they've lost, what they've given up for their country. So I had no quarrel with the president's decision on Syria, but I know many people in the House were, and many people in the Senate were, and spoke about it at some length. But we'd never given an authorization for use of military force in Syria. So if we wanted to be in Syria, we should have done that. That's our obligation, Mr. Engel. That's our obligation. Your committee should have had hearings and met and produced an authorization for use of military force. We could have taken it up here in the Rules Committee, and if we wanted to be in Syria, by God, we'd be in Syria today. But the president wasn't going to do it unilaterally. He didn't feel he had the authorization. We didn't give it to him, and he made the decision that he did. Again, some people agreed, some people disagreed. I have a lot of difficulty with what we've been handed today, and part of the difficulty is the time frame. We got this really literally moments before this Rules Hearing Committee convened. We only have one amendment. I'm glad we have one amendment. I'm glad we're at least going to consider one amendment to something that's this important. Probably there are other members of the United States House of Representatives who might want to file an amendment, who might be interested in coming up here and spending a greater part of their evening in the Committee on Rules.
We'll consider one amendment if he's patient enough to remain until we all go through this panel.
But this is one of the most important things we do. Mr. Engel, Mr. McGovern, Mr. Hastings are the only people in this committee who are in this committee room who were here when the last authorization passed in October of 2002. I wasn't in Congress. Mr. Cole wasn't in Congress. We came several months later, but there's not been another authorization for use of military force since that time. Now, you're arguing now that this is not good enough. Well, okay, we should have those discussions, but that should be us. That's your committee to do the hearings, do the markup, pass the bill, send it to the Rules Committee, and we'll be glad to have the debate. I will tell you the language of the resolution that we've got in front of us. Section 1, termination of the use of United States Armed Forces to engage in hostilities against Iran. Mr. McCall, are we engaged in hostilities in the country of Iran right now?
I mean, we're not. This is reminiscent of the Yemen resolution. We had to make the same argument. If we were engaged in Yemen, I would, okay, fine. But we had the same debate on the Yemen resolution. We're not actively engaged in hostilities in Yemen. We're not actively engaged in hostilities in Iran. I would be the first one to speak up if we were, to say Congress needs to authorize this. Then it goes beyond Article 2 to Article 1. That would trigger.
And I would even suggest that looking back on the data that when the 2002 authorization for use of military force passed, again, it went through regular order in Committee on Foreign Affairs. It had a CBO score attached to it. Turns out they were pretty close to right. They said it's going to cost between $1 and $4 billion a month, and we can make no projection as to the duration. Well, that was, pretty darn accurate when you look back on it. Nobody expected the last 9 years was the difficulty that we encountered. But that's the level of importance. A vote on an authorization for use of military force is probably one of the most important votes we can take as a member of Congress. Only 3 people on this committee, and including witnesses in this room, have had to take that vote. It's not something that should come to the committee at the last minute. It's not something that should be drafted in the Speaker's office, and then 30 minutes later, we're having a debate in the Rules Committee. That's not the appropriate order for us to take. As far as the Iraq parliamentary resolution that they passed, and I know what I've seen in the press, not in the classified briefing, but what I've read in the papers, is there wasn't a participation from all parts of the parliament. Some people had left. Okay, fair enough. The next day, there was a statement that later retracted from our Department of Defense that said, we're withdrawing all our troops. I actually thought that was a masterful stroke. Okay, you don't want us? We're going. And good luck with those ISIS guys next time around. Turns out that wasn't the case, and it does need to be done in a much more thoughtful manner. I think the fact that they had that vote without the entire complement of the representatives in the Iraqi parliament was an error on their part, and it would have been wrong for us to react just based upon that vote. Look, this is a difficult situation. I think we should all be grateful today, reflecting on where we were 24 hours ago. I think we should all be grateful today that the opportunity for de-escalation has occurred. Some reports that I saw in the press last night that Iran intentionally did not strike to kill. I don't know whether that's true or not. We didn't actually hear that in our briefing, and I haven't read that in any other source today, but it's possible. And if so, then that's an overture, that's an opening to continued discussion. And the president, I think, alluded to that in his talk today, that there is an opportunity to come to the table and talk about how do we get past this point. Now, I thank God we're at that point today. I thank God for the wisdom of the president and his restraint. Thank God for the bravery of our men and women over there. We know this story isn't over. I agree with Mr. Hastings. The world's a dangerous place. They're going to continue to try to do things to us. And we got to be better than they are every single day, every hour of every day. I thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say, I know Mr. McCall and Mr. Engel have other engagements tonight, and so I want to make sure everyone gets their questions in, but I want to see if we can abbreviate it a little bit here. Mr. Perlmutter.
Yeah, just a couple questions. And just to finish sort of the conversation that Mr. Burgess was just on, when you look at line 22 on page 3 of the resolution, B, termination, talks about Congress hereby directs the President to terminate the use of United States Armed Forces to engage in hostilities in or against Iran or any part of its government or military unless, and then you look down at line 6, section 2, such use of the armed forces is necessary and appropriate to defend against an imminent armed attack. Based on the President's statement today, his concern was there had been an attack, in effect, against the embassy, and that there was potential imminent attack going forward. So I would argue with my friend Mr. Burgess, which I'm often apt to do, that if we are to take the President at his word, this resolution doesn't affect him or what he did one bit. But I think where I'm coming from, and I would disagree with Mr. Woodall on this, that for us to say we're not going, we, the Congress, we, the House of Representatives, and we have to, under Article 1, say we declare war. And if we don't say it, there is no war. There's not supposed to be. So I think, Mr. McCall, you said early on that this is just a non-binding resolution, and I would say, you know, it could be a lot stronger, it could be weaker, but it's saying we're not going to war with Iran unless there's a declaration by Congress. I mean, isn't that all it says to you, Mr. McCall?
Well, first of all, it is non-binding, which means it doesn't go to the president. I would argue, if we're really serious about this, as Mr. Woodall and Mr. Cole stated, and Mr. Burgess, if we're very, if you read the War Powers Act, it should be referred to our committee. We should deliberate as a body. We should mark it up. Then we should have a vote and not make it a concurrent resolution that is non-binding that goes over to the Senate. If we're really serious about this and exercising our Article 1 authorities, why aren't we doing this where it goes to the president's desk? This will never see the president's desk. And that's why I don't
But
think
I guess, the
point.
point here is to say to the president, okay, maybe what occurred here to a very bad guy, Soleimani, and I think we can all agree about that, And I want to ask some questions just about the people that he's killed and when was the last time, which I think it was probably by the IEDs 2011 or something like that. But I think it's the Congress is derelict in its duties if we don't say, you got to come to us before you maintain hostilities against another nation. Now, that may be just, 8th grade civics, and we're just repeating what the Constitution says. But I think we have to, given all of the places President Bush went under the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs, and all the places that President Obama has gone under the terms of 2001 and 2002 AUMF, and President Trump. So I don't think what we're doing is irresponsible or premature. It is asserting the right of Congress, the House of Representatives, to say, okay, maybe what you did in taking out the commander of the Iranian armed services was a good thing, but if we're going to get into prolonged hostilities, you better come to Congress. That's what this is, and that's why I support it. And I'll also say, so let me just ask you,
Well,
Mr.
actually, I agree with the intent and spirit of that, but this is nothing more than a statement. This has it's not binding.
And I hear you, and you and I might
just... It will never get to the president's desk. And it's a rushed process.
And those things all may be true. But, on the other hand, something happened. There was an escalation from Christmas till New Year's.
True.
Very quickly. We weren't here. Now we're responding to that. And I think my friend from Maryland would like to say something, so I yield to him. And I know, Mr. Chairman, you want us to get going, and I hear you. But this is serious stuff that we're talking about.
Thank you, but I'll wait my turn, and then I'll weigh in at that point.
All right, so here's my question, and then just a final thought. So my question to you two, because the numbers have been thrown around a lot, 600 and thousands, and many people. I mean, our conflict was in Iraq. It was primarily against the Sunnis. It's been against ISIS. But Soleimani and maybe the judge and you all, because of your privy to other information, 600 people, 600 of our servicemen and women were killed. Thousands have been maimed. Did that ever come to an end or a cessation? Because I'm thinking it came to an end or a cessation in about 2011. Am I wrong? Am I wrong?
I'm sorry, what was the question again?
When you say 600 servicemen and women were killed and thousands were maimed, even though we were never really in a direct conflict with Iran, but because they had the signature on these IEDs. Did that ever come to a stop? Or because my understanding is that IED and all that stuff stopped in 2011. And it was in Iraq, primarily.
Well, I would argue that it has not stopped and that Soleimani killed an American on December 27th and wounded 4 soldiers.
All right. So, but before that?
I don't know the exact date when this stopped. It did wind down, yes.
All right. So then we had an Iraqi American was killed the 26th or 27th or something like that, or right around Christmas. And then we struck back with airstrikes, and we killed a bunch of Shia militia. Then they had their funeral, which then broke out into a siege of our embassy, and then we had the strike, the drone strike, rocket strike against their commander. And then they had their rockets against us.
I think it's important to go back to last October to see the escalation and the strikes that occurred. and the restraint by the president not to respond to this stuff. And it escalated, the tension got, and the reason why is because Soleimani decided to unleash the proxies. He said, I'm preparing the proxies to go to war.
So, Mr.
Soleimani
McCall, you and I can go through tit for tat. I mean, it may have started, it may have started with us withdrawing from the
When the General Soleimani
JCPOA.
says, prepare the proxies for war, he did. That's what changed.
Well, no, what changed was us withdrawing from the JCPOA. That's what started.
Where 150 billion in cash was given to the Ayatollah and the regime that got funneled into terrorism.
All right.
You think that was a good idea?
I'm just saying this has been back and forth. So my
It is,
question,
and we're not here to debate that.
Okay,
We're here to
you're
debate
right.
the authorization of Congress.
we're here to debate this resolution. You're right, and I'm sorry, I've
We can
taken
debate-
it beyond where it
Our committee's
belongs.
about debating foreign policy, and we do it all the time.
You're right. You're right. I agree with you. I took it beyond where I wanted to go because we're talking about this resolution. I mean, I personally may think that what occurred, you know, we're going to see a resurgence of ISIS. I may or may not be right. I think we've seen a unification or a united Sunni and Shia, which I never thought would happen. That's what we've seen in Iraq recently. We've seen in Iran, a divided public there sort of come together to honor this guy Soleimani. And you know what? I think in the long run, you may be right. The world may be safer with this guy gone. I'd say in the short run, it's not. And I'm going to support this resolution. I think it just asserts Congress's right to say, you got to come to us before you can declare war, Mr. President. And I think it's time that the Congress did something like that. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you.
And I fully respect your views.
Thank you. Mrs. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask both of the chairman and the ranking member some questions. But first, I think it's important, very relevant. I wanted to read some words from Democrat Joe Lieberman. He just wrote a guest column. I usually read the Wall Street Journal, and I thought it was very
I don't think he's a Democrat anymore.
telling. President Trump, these are his words, President Trump's order to take out Soleimani was morally, constitutionally, and strategically correct. It deserves more bipartisan support than the begrudging or negative reactions it has received thus far from my fellow Democrats. That divided response suggests the partisanship that has infected and disabled so much of U.S. domestic policy now also determines our elected officials or elected leaders' responses to major foreign policy events and national security issues, even the killing of a man responsible for murdering hundreds of Americans and planning to kill thousands more. And I jump ahead a couple. No American can dispute that Soleimani created, supported, and directed a network of terrorist organizations that spread havoc in the Middle East. In Syria, he made it possible for Assad regime to respond with brutality to its own people's demands for freedom. More than 500,000 Syrians have died since 2011, and millions more have been displaced from their homes. During the Iraq War, Soleimani oversaw 3 camps in Iran where his elite Quds force trained and equipped Iraqi militias. According to the U.S. government, these fighters have killed more than 600 American soldiers since 2003. And lastly, I'm going to read another part where it says, some Democrats have said that killing Soleimani will lead us into war with Iran. And here we are today, this war resolution. In fact, Soleimani and the Quds force have been at war with the United States for years. It is more likely that his death will diminish the chances of a wider conflict because the demonstration of our willingness to kill him will give Iranian leaders and probably others like Kim Jong-un much to fear. And I thought Mr. Cole and Mr. Woodall did an excellent job of talking about why they think this resolution today is not what some of my Democratic colleagues are saying that it actually does. But I do want to ask you, Mr. McCall, a question. Soleimani was a terrorist. Under what administration was he labeled a terrorist?
Yeah, that was under the Bush administration.
Okay. And you had mentioned this, and I want to see if you agree with this statement and if you've heard this statement yourself, and this is from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The trigger for the drone strike that killed Soleimani was clear, unambiguous intelligence indicating a significant campaign of violence against the United States in the days, weeks, and months, and that the administration would have been culpably negligent if it did not act. Is that your understanding of what he said?
No, yes, and I've talked to him personally about
And
what he acted upon and why he feels that way.
And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Engel, I have a question for you. This has been brought up briefly before. There's many instances where President Obama had authorized drone attacks. It says, during President Obama's tenure, 1,878 drone strikes were conducted, a number of which were in countries we were not formally at war with, including Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Libya. In fact, without any authorization from Congress at all, President Obama ordered the U.S. military to take the lead in the initial stage of intervention in the 2011 Libyan civil war by suppressing air defenses and establishing a no-fly zone, followed by support of airstrikes against Gaddafi forces. So, Mr. Engel, Chairman Engel, how is that different? What has changed? Why is this different today? Why are we doing this today? Why are we not going through your committee? Why are we doing this in such an expedited fashion if under President Obama these things are true?
Well, I think we're doing it today, and I support this now, is because I'd like to think I'm older and wiser. I don't know if you were here before when I mentioned that all the wars, the authority to go to war in the Bush administration and other things similar to that, I've supported. But I have come to feel very strongly that Congress, period, declares war. Designation as a terrorist is not what authorizes military force. The AUMF's authorized military force. And the 2001 AUMF applies to the terrorists who attacked us on September 11th, 2001, not to Iran. And the 2002 AUMF applies to the threat posed by Iraq, not Iran. So I think it's appropriate that we do this now, because this is a different situation, dealing with a different country, with Iran. And I think as I said before, we need to reclaim that very important power of Congress to declare war and do it against any administration of any party who would do it. I feel a lot different now. We have our experience to go by, and I think it was a disaster. And I think something that sucks us into endless war is not good for the country. If some people think it's good for the country, well, then Congress has to decide that, not the president.
Well, and thank you, Chairman Engel, and I share your sentiment, as do other members of the Republicans, except that the language in this resolution, it says clearly, I feel like what some of the members are saying this does is not what it says it does. Because it clearly says to terminate the use of United States armed forces to engage in hostilities in or against Iran. It does not say if in the future we go into, excuse me? I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm at the beginning. Directing the President, pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution, to terminate the use of United States armed forces to engage in hostilities in or against Iran. Resolved, but I'm reading page 1. And that is, I'll let you talk later. That's on a different page. Okay, and so what I'm saying is that then we ask Ranking Member McCall, well, are there any troops in Iran, U.S. troops? Are we engaged in any direct hostilities in or against Iran? And I think your answer was no.
No.
We're not currently. So I guess I'm like boggled. This doesn't make any sense to me. It makes no sense to me that you're saying, okay, we're going to terminate something that doesn't even exist, but then let's say you thought it did exist, or you thought we were getting in war. Then there's a different mechanism to do that, to actually do what Mr. Chairman Engel wants us to do. And that's to go through your committee, not the Rules Committee. There's a definite thing to do this. So to me, this totally boggles me. I guess it's just another demonstration of how you can't stand President Trump. It's the only thing I can think of. And so I oppose this resolution, and I yield back.
Thank you. And let me just say for the record, I think the reason why, at least I think this is important, is because I can't stand wars that are not authorized by Congress, where young people lose their lives. And this is not just about President Trump. I mean, the issue of Libya has been brought up here on several occasions. I'd like to submit for the record a statement I made back in March of 2011, urging the then leadership of this House to call us back into session so that we could actually debate in AUMF to basically define the parameters of our military involvement in Libya. Ms. Lesko, some of us have been talking about this in Democratic and in Republican administrations about the need for Congress to reclaim its constitutional authority when it comes to war. And so it's not about, I don't like President Trump, and it's not about, I didn't like President Bush. I was consistent when President Obama was president as well. I think many of us were. And I think this is about reclaiming our authority. And by the way, some of us are worried that we were on the brink of war with Iran, and that we could be there again very, very soon. All this says is that if we are going to go to war with Iran, then Congress has a role to play. And if that is radical, if that is controversial, and if people don't like it, then they can vote no on this resolution.
Mr.
Yes,
Chairman,
yeah.
can I just respond briefly? I'm sorry, we're going back and forth.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying. I understand what Chairman Engel is saying. I'm understanding what Mr. Cole, all of us are saying about that Congress should be the one that determines if we get into war. But this isn't what's happening here.
Well,
We're not in war. In fact, it was de-escalated.
well,
And so you're saying to eliminate something that hasn't even taken place.
For the moment, it is de-escalated. We came very, very, if you had talked to me yesterday or the day before, I might have come to a different conclusion. But I have no idea where this president wants to lead us in terms of our Iran policy, and I received no assurances from the briefing that we attended today about what the long-term plan is, nor did I receive any assurance from the president in his statement today. So all I'm simply saying is that essentially this is basically a statement, by the Congress that we have a role to play in this. And it is not unique to this. Some of us have been saying this with regard to Libya, with regard to Syria, with regard to so many other places that we've been involved with. If people want to make it into something it isn't, that's fine. But I think some of us have been consistent. Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. We are a constitutional democracy governed by the rule of law. That's in wartime, that's in peacetime. That's domestic policy, that's foreign policy. We operate under the rule of law in America. So I appreciate very much the tenor of this conversation because I've heard from most of our colleagues across the aisle that they are very concerned about unilateral presidential wars, and that they're not that far from wanting to support this, but either they have a problem with some of the procedures that have taken place in the House or they think it may be unnecessary. I'd like to try and persuade my colleagues to do this. I would like to persuade my colleagues that this is the resolution everybody is actually asking for on that side of the aisle. I wish my friend Mr. Woodall were still in the room, because I was very moved by his remarks, and I especially liked when he said he's not a foreign policy expert. And you know what? I want to start with the exact same caveat. I'm not a foreign policy expert. I'm not on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm not on the Intelligence Committee. There's one thing I pretty much know, which is the Constitution of the United States, and I see all of this through the prism of the Constitution and the rule of law. And what did the framers of the Constitution do? They gave Congress the exclusive power to declare war. They gave Congress the exclusive power to appropriate monies for war. They gave Congress the exclusive power to raise and support armies, and they gave Congress the exclusive power to create and maintain a navy. Okay, all of that is put on Congress. Now, you can go back and read the constitutional conventions and read the framers. Why were they so emphatic about it? Why were they so adamant about this? Was it just sort of accidental that they put it under Article 1 rather than under Article 2? After all, some people seem to think it's more logical that it'd be under Article 2. After all, the president is denominated the commander-in-chief, not of the armed forces, but of the Army and Navy, and the militia when it's actually called up, okay? So why didn't they just go ahead and say everything having to do with war and foreign policy is under the president? You know why? And the framers were very explicit about it. Because they were rebelling against centuries of princes and kings and monarchs plunging their populations into wars of vanity, wars of ambition, and wars of political advantage and calculation in order to distract the population from domestic problems. That was precisely why they didn't want to vest the awesome power of life and death, which Ms. Torres has discussed so eloquently. They did not want to vest that power in one guy, in one person. So who got the power? The representatives of the people. The representatives of the people from Arizona, the representatives of the people from Oklahoma, the representatives of the people from Florida, from Texas, from Massachusetts, and on in New York. It is the representatives of the people who have to make that very weighty, awesome decision under our constitutional design. Now, Madison said that the declare war power, or the power in the declare war clause, still gives the president to respond to emergency attacks on the country. Even the framers understood that if there's an imminent threat of an attack on the country, the president could deal with that. That became clear during the Civil War in 1863 in cases called the prize cases, the prize decisions, where Lincoln was upheld in his blockading and embargoing the southern states. And he did it unilaterally, and the Supreme Court said the president's got the power to act unilaterally when it's to defend the country against an imminent attack. Now, the War Powers Act was adopted in 1973, and I think it reincarnated both of those central constitutional understandings. That it was essentially Congress's power to declare war, because the people's representatives have to be the ones to send the people's sons and daughters into battle. But the president could act in imminent self-defense for the country. So the War Powers Act says a couple things. Let's look and see how this president has done. He's done very poorly on some stuff, but he's done all right on others. So if you look at Section 1542, the president in every possible instance shall consult with Congress before introducing United States Armed Forces into hostilities. He didn't do that. Now, he consulted with some members of his party. Apparently, he consulted with some members of the public, according to some published reports, who were at Mar-a-Lago, where he was when he made this decision. But he didn't come to Congress. He didn't talk to the so-called Gang of Eight, the majority and the minority leaders in the House and the Senate, and the foreign affairs and intelligence leaders of both the House and the Senate. I don't believe that that happened. Okay. Now, he did, however, come to us within 48 hours of the targeted killing, as some people call it, the assassination, as others would call it, or the act of war, as others are calling it. I don't want to weigh in on that. But in any event, he did come to Congress within 48 hours. And there is a very brief account of the reasons for this, which can be found just by members of Congress in the skiff. Okay, but now here is the thing that I think is so important right now, and here's why we're acting. It has been said a couple of times that this is a non-binding resolution. I don't know what that is based on. If you look at Section 1544 of the War Powers Act, which I think is 50 U.S.C. 33, the War Powers Resolution, if you look at 1544C, it says concurrent resolution for removal by President of United States Armed Forces. Notwithstanding subsection B, at any time that United States Armed Forces are engaged in hostilities outside the territory of the United States, its possessions and territories, without a declaration of war or specific statutory authorization, such forces shall be removed by the President if the Congress so directs by concurrent resolution. And if you look at the resolution before us today, it is titled H-Con Res, concurrent resolution. This is a concurrent resolution. In other words, it operates precisely under the War Powers Act, which has never been struck down, which is under the war powers of Congress under Article 1. So what is it saying? Well, it is saying, I think, precisely what our colleagues are asking for. Mr. Woodall says, I want to try to quote him correctly here, especially because he's not in the room, but he basically says, why aren't we going to have the debate over war? Why aren't we, and he's asking the right question, why aren't we going to have the debate about the benefits and the costs of the action against Soleimani? Why aren't we going to have a debate about what our policy towards Iran is going to be? Why would we unleash all of these consequences? The Iraqi parliament is voting to kick us out of their country. The millions of people in Iran marching against us when they were marching against the government 2 weeks ago. All of this stuff has turned around, and without prejudging what's the right answer or the wrong answer on any of it, it is up to us to decide this. We've got to decide it. So when Mr. Woodall says, when are we going to have the debate, that's precisely what the resolution is saying. The resolution is saying no further military hostilities against Iran until we have a debate and we either have statutory authorization for the introduction of military forces there or a declaration of war. And so when are we going to have the debate? We're going to have the debate under this resolution as soon as we decide to have the debate, because we're the ones who have to go forward. And I want everyone to think about this. It's not just the power to declare war and to fund war and so on that the framers invested us with. It was the duty to do it. Because sometimes people think, well, it's just the presidents have usurped all of our powers. You know, going back to Korea and Vietnam and Grenada and Libya and Nicaragua and so on and so forth. It's just the presidents who've run off with the power. No, I think we've got to be institutionally honest and reflective about this. There is a lot of thinking among some members that, you know what, it's better if we don't have to vote on war. It's better if we don't have to declare war or vote on authorization. We'll let the president do it, and if things work out, great. Then we'll be able to say, yeah, we were with you the whole way, I supported it, and if things turn into a debacle and a nightmare and a waste of national treasure and life, then we say, oh, I never supported it in the first place. So I think that we have not only the power to vote on this, we've got the duty to vote on this, so we don't blunder into wars like the wars we've seen recently in Afghanistan, for example, which has gone on for, I don't even know how many years, 18 years? 18 years has cost more than $1 trillion and so on and so forth. We've got a responsibility to act, and so I believe that we need to do this constitutionally. We clearly have the power to do it. I think we've got the responsibility to do it. And let me just close with a quote that I saw in the Senate Conference Committee report when they passed the War Powers Resolution back in 1973. We live in an age of undeclared war, which has meant presidential war. Prolonged engagement in undeclared presidential war has created a most dangerous imbalance in our constitutional system of checks and balances. This was not the design of the framers and the founders. We cannot run away from our responsibilities, and we shouldn't. We should step up to the plate and say, this is something that we will deal with, and we are not going to leave it to a president of any party. This is not a partisan thing, but no president should have that power and be able to run away with the question that is rightfully and dutifully ours.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon?
May I give a quick response?
Sure.
And I'll make it, no, we're all getting tired. And let me, I appreciate your passion and your legal knowledge. I went to law school, not Harvard, but I got through. And just a couple of things. You did, concede that under Article 2, under an imminent threat, the president does have authority to act in that type of situation, correct?
But I think he does under a real imminent threat. Now, of course, the devil's in the details there of what is an imminent threat, because we don't want any president just saying anytime they want to get into a war, they view it as an imminent threat. And so I think we got to reserve judgment about how imminent this threat was, because I don't know that we've gotten a proper answer from the administration.
And I get that.
Yeah.
I get the answer may not have been as satisfactory. We're not engaged in hostilities in Iran. That's the other premise. We are already there in Iraq. But if I could cite the INS versus Shada case, which was in 1985 after the 1973 congressional action, you cited 1544C. It states very clearly, U.S. Supreme Court law, Congress's Article I legislative powers are exercised only pursuant to the constitutional process that involves presentment to the president and veto procedure, which concurrent resolutions do not.
Okay, so
So what I'm saying is,
I'm going to answer that.
this
because
is not binding law,
well,
what you're doing here today.
Let me quickly
It's a
answer that.
statement.
Let me just very quickly answer that. America doesn't go to war unless a war has been declared by Congress. And so if you have concurrent majorities in the House and Senate saying, we're not declaring a war, then there can't be a war. So it's very simple. So, I liken this to the situation actually with the emoluments clauses, which say that the President of the United States cannot collect foreign government payments without the consent of Congress. And it only takes one house to say, we don't consent to this or that payment you've received from a foreign government. And if it says it, that's not a one-house veto. That's just one house saying, we don't consent and you affirmatively need to get our consent. It's the exact same situation with a declaration of war. Otherwise, we'd be saying the president could get into whatever wars he wanted to, and you would need 2/3 of the House and the Senate to get the president out of war. And that is a total defeat of the constitutional design.
Well, let me just say, I agree with you on your passion about Article I, and I hope we can do this in a more thoughtful manner, not rush through in the middle, one-day notice. War and peace issues deserve more proper consideration.
And you make, I agree with that, and it's a great argument, and it's precisely why it's supposed to go to Congress for deliberation rather than the president, because when the president does it, then now suddenly we're thrown off of our timetable. We have to try to react to the president. I can't remember if you or someone else said, well, he had, a clear majority in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'm sorry, that's not the Constitution. Someone said, well, his whole cabinet supported it. Well, that's within his branch of government, but we represent the people of the United States. We've got to get back to basics here, which is we represent the people. The president's job is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed.
Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you, and thank you to the gentleman from Maryland for that very articulate summary of the constitutional issues. I do think it's important to point out that we have all agreed, I think on both sides of the aisle here, that Soleimani was a bad actor and he will not be missed. The gentlewoman from Arizona raised the fact that the Bush administration was the first administration to declare him a terrorist. Do I have that right?
Actually, I want to correct that because I got from staff, it was actually, he was officially designated under the Obama administration.
Okay.
Yeah.
Am I correct that both the Bush administration and the Obama administration had opportunities to target him?
Yes.
Okay. As have the Israelis?
I can't speak to the Israelis. They would defer to us.
Okay. And up until now, no one has viewed the benefits of taking him out to outweigh the risks. Is that correct?
But the risks have been greater
Well, that's
over the
the
last
argument
year.
we're being presented with
Well,
now, correct?
it's pretty well documented, but yeah.
Well, that's the argument the administration's making now. And again, nobody is saying that the administration doesn't have the power to attack us or to protect the nation from an imminent threat. But what we are concerned with, and what I believe this resolution is dealing with, is that the administration has to justify such action, and that it has to prove that there's an imminent threat to national security or to national interests other than impeachment. And then it has to be able to explain its strategy moving forward. And we're just trying to use the tools that we have under the War Powers Act to try to compel that kind of explanation to Congress, which does hold the authority to authorize continuing action. I also want to just point out that this is a bipartisan concern. We've certainly heard now from Senators Lee and Paul, and I believe we have some members of the House who are also concerned about this. And with that, I would yield back.
Thank you. Be very brief, but I was actually just looking at the comments made by Senator Lee, since a former member of the Senate has been referenced and quoted, but Senator Lee said today after the briefing that we had, that the Senate had following the briefing we had, he called it the worst briefing I've seen, at least on a military issue. He said that I find this insulting and demeaning to the office that each of the 100 senators in this building happens to hold. I find it insulting and demeaning to the Constitution of the United States. He said he found the briefing absolutely insane. I think that's unacceptable. Senator Paul said he found the briefing less than satisfying and knocked the administration for using the 2002 war authorization as the basis for the airstrike. He said, I see no way in the world you could logically argue that the authorization to have war with Saddam Hussein has anything to do with having war with people currently in Iraq. And I'll say briefly, because I think my hat's off to my colleagues who have expressed this far better than I could and far more eloquently. I find nothing at all in conflict with the Constitution and Article 1 and Article 2 powers inherent in this resolution. I think this actually sets forth very appropriately that imminent threats and the ability to defend the United States and its national security interests are not in any way impeded by this if the President determines that there's a true, legitimate, imminent threat. Frankly, and I'd be concerned not to say anything relative to the briefings, but there's been no detail given to members of the House and Senate on what those imminent threats were. And this, I think, restores appropriately the balance of power that exists between Article 1 and Article 2 institutions. The President to conduct war, but only after a declaration by the United States Congress, which has not happened. I think this is entirely appropriate. I thank my colleagues for articulating this far better than I could, but I'll support the
I
resolution.
think Mr. Raskin made that say. I would tell you that I think Milley started to get into it today, but I think if they came forward to declassify more, what they're concerned about are sources and methods and people that have given us this information, such that we don't want to burn these assets on the ground. And the judge, you know this. This is operation security. And so that's the overall arching concern, but could we have a better explanation, you know? I look forward to that.
Shalala?
You know, I'm not a foreign policy expert either, but I know Iran because I've lived there, and I know the literature on Iran, and there's no question about their role in supporting terrorism, and killing someone like Soleimani, I wouldn't defend at all, because he clearly was responsible for thousands of lives. But the President of the United States, in his response to Iran, announced that he would commit a war crime by targeting the cultural sites of Iran. When I don't care what party is represented by the presidency, when the President of the United States indicates that he's prepared to commit a war crime, then Congress better step up and reassert its authority under the Constitution to demand that the President justify any act. And that's exactly what this resolution does, and that's why I'm going to support it.
Well, thank you very much, and there's no other questions, so we appreciate you being here, and you're free to go. Thank you.
You really mean it? Thank you.
Yeah. We have one other witness here. I'd like to welcome our next panel, which is made up of Mr. Gates. We're delighted that you are here. Anything that you brought in writing, submit to the record, but gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is your mic on? Just make
It
sure.
is, sir.
Okay, good.
I take a backseat to no member of the Congress when it comes to defending the president and animating the America First agenda with my support for it. And that's why I reject the notion that this amendment was brought insincerely, or this resolution, I should say, brought insincerely or as a political gesture. In fact, I had conversations with the sponsor of the resolution, Congresswoman Slotkin, who is an expert in this area and who I believe has drafted into this resolution not only sufficient but exemplary definitions of the self-defense metrics that would be applied to any decision to use force. So I want to thank her for that effort. Mr. Chairman, I represent more troops than any other member of the United States Congress. One of my constituents will be buried at Arlington tomorrow after having died in Afghanistan just days before Christmas. And so I appreciate and accept how personal this is to everyone, and it certainly is to me as well. I have heard for hours much of the debate in the Rules Committee center around whether or not the killing of Soleimani was justified. And I would offer to the committee that that is entirely beside the point of this resolution. Folks can reasonably disagree about whether or not killing Soleimani was a good idea or a bad idea. Personally, I think it was a good idea, but I understand there are others who hold different views. But the operative function of this resolution is not to nitpick or question whether or not that was a sound decision. It is to set properly the role of Congress in any further determination regarding hostilities toward Iran. The amendment that I have offered strikes the second sentence of Section 1(5), which is the only reference to Soleimani in the entire resolution. And so if we remove and sequester the debate about Soleimani, I would think that we would be able to achieve broad bipartisan agreement that on a going forward basis, the United States should not engage in a war with Iran absent congressional approval. That is what is in the Constitution. It is what I have heard almost all of you say over the course of the last several hours. And it would seem to, my amendment would seem to resolve the dispute over these questions of division. When my Republican colleagues say, oh, this will be this terribly divisive act, if we remove the reference to Soleimani, it should not be divisive that on a going forward basis, the Congress must approve any war with Iran. I'll conclude with this, Mr. Chairman. If my constituents, if all of your constituents can be brave enough to go and fight these wars, in the United States Congress, we ought to be brave enough to vote for them or against them. And I yield back.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate it. And we've had this discussion on the floor about the language that you want to remove, which, quite frankly, I actually support the language. But I take it to heart your concerns, and I think it really is important that we get a bipartisan vote on this. So I'll be happy to partner with you to try to make sure that the language that you want eliminated is eliminated in the underlying bill, so we can bring this to the floor and hopefully.
And Mr. Chairman, if that is done, if that language is removed regarding Soleimani, I will vote for this resolution, and it will be a bipartisan resolution. Right. I yield back.
Who wants to? Anybody, Anybody have any questions? Oh, any other? All right, we will do that. Thank you. Thank you for the patience in being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any other members wishing to testify on H-Con Res 83? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on H-Con Res 83.
They're coming, they're coming. We're getting motion.
We have the motion yet? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
set?
Wait, give it a minute to pass out.
You going partying or you need a ride home?
We ready? Oh, you guys got it? You have it? You ready?
Surely there was enough time to get it ready.
No, it is ready. Is you ready? All right. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant H. Conres 83, directing the President pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution to terminate the use of United States Armed Forces to engage in hostilities in or against Iran, or a closed rule. The rule provides 2 hours of debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the concurrent resolution. The rule provides that the amendment to the concurrent resolution printed in the Rules Committee report shall be considered as adopted, and the concurrent resolution as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the concurrent resolution as amended. Finally, the rule provides that Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution shall not apply during the remainder of the 116th Congress to a measure respecting Iran.
You've heard the motion of the gentleman from Florida. Is there any amendment or discussion? Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and it's been a long night, but I just want to thank everybody here, honestly, that spoke. I know everybody very serious about this issue, and I just want my colleagues to know I respect that. The amendment I have, Mr. Chairman, would move that the committee postpone consideration of H. Concurrent Resolution 83, directing the President pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution to terminate the use of United States Armed Forces to engage in hostilities with Iran until January 28, 2020. As I noted in my opening statement, Mr. Chairman, this, in my view, this amendment, the resolution just simply not ready for the floor. We only had members briefed today by the administration. War Powers Resolution, to its credit, actually provides for pretty swift action. It'd only be 15 calendar days. We would actually refer it back to the Committee of Jurisdiction. And the amendment simply delays consideration of the legislation to allow the House ample opportunity to ensure that we really do have a robust, open, bipartisan discussion. And, you know, going back to the Foreign Affairs Committee, I think is honestly a pretty good place to go back to, because you've got a chairman and a ranking member that clearly work together and clearly, quite often, produce bipartisan products. You know, I think we're bombarded daily, I know I am, on Ingle-McCall releases where they have come to the same conclusion. And I also think, you know, one of the things that concerns me about the resolution in front of us, which I think could be corrected, first of all, it sort of implies that we're, you know, the administration is racing toward war. I would suggest the facts suggest exactly the opposite. I mean, the reality is, again, we've had a whole series of provocative actions by the Iranians. You know, first, it's, you know, targeting ships in the Gulf. What's the presidential response? Well, let's get a international, you know, effort to protect shipping, not strike at Iran. Let's try to protect the shipping as it goes through. The next thing we see is a strike at Saudi oil refinery facility. What's the response? Well, let's send some Patriot batteries over there. Let's try to protect them, not an attack on Iran. The next thing is we have, and there's a dispute about this to be fair, but we have drones, I would argue, in international airspace. The Iranians would say not. You know, the military, you know, is recommending a strike as a retaliation. What's the president's reaction? Oh, nobody was killed. Let's not do that. Let's, you know. Then we have a whole series of attacks by surrogates, let's be fair, the Shiite militias that are operating in concert with the Iranians on allied troops, when we're actually in a country supposedly fighting the same people the Iranians are. And is there anything done? No, there's some protests, nothing. Not until an American is killed. And then is there an attack on Iran? No. Or on Iran. There's an attack on one single individual that everybody around this dais agrees is a terrorist of long standing and has killed and maimed thousands of people and is violating a UN resolution by being there in the first place. I just think we have a better chance of getting to a bipartisan result by going back and letting this process work its way through. And I think it removes the implication that there's somehow a danger that the administration's rushing to war. I'd actually say they have, been remarkably restrained in dealing with a series of provocations by the Iranians. And what I hope came out of what happened is that the Iranians themselves may be doing a little rethinking. And I would suggest, frankly, the nature of their retaliation, quote unquote, last night suggests that they are. And the fact that they were so quick to say, hey, if this is it, if there's no more from us either. Now, I think we all are skeptical about how long that lasts in terms of dealing with this particular regime. But there's a big difference here. So this is not a gotcha thing. This is just an effort to go back, try and make this bipartisan, spend the time, have the hearings, have the discussion. Probably the most common phrase I heard tonight is everybody began their remarks pretty much with, well, I'm not a foreign policy expert. Well, why don't we send it back to the committee that's full of foreign policy experts and let them call foreign policy experts, let them bring in the administration, which ought to be accounting for, okay, this was our thinking, this is what we're doing, have the witnesses. And again, under the War Powers Act, this is not an effort to draw it out to some indefinite time. They'd be limited to the time frame we suggest. So I just think this would move us in the right direction, and I offer it in that spirit.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and I'll just say a couple of things. One is, again, this resolution basically says if the president wants to go to war in Iran, he has to come to Congress. That's all it says. In an attempt to try to make it bipartisan, the gentleman from Florida came here. He wanted a line removed from the bill that he found objectionable, even though I didn't. We in this rule, we will remove that line, and he will vote for it, a Republican, hopefully other Republicans will as well. And I just want to say one thing, and I have nothing but the greatest respect for the gentleman, and I know, and we're going to work together, as I mentioned before, on a series of hearings here in the Rules Committee on how we reclaim some of our constitutional powers that are rightfully ours, and we reinforce the necessary checks and balances. But when everyone talks about the president being restrained, I must have been living on a different planet the last week. I mean, I've been reading his Twitter account. The gentlewoman from Florida reminded us about how he threatened to bomb cultural sites. He's threatened 52 targets, I think America is traumatized by watching the president these last days bring us right to the brink of war with Iran. And when my biggest worry was the increased likelihood of a miscalculation, and that we would be sucked into a war that, quite frankly, is totally unnecessary. So we can have our differences about the Soleimani assassination. We can debate that all we want, but that's not what this is about. This is about if, in fact, we get into this further, that Congress has to have a vote, and we will have time at that particular point for the Foreign Affairs Committee to provide us the expertise, and we will have that vote on the floor, and we will have all the things that my colleagues want. But I respect the gentleman, and I would urge my colleagues to vote no on his amendment. So the vote now is on the.
Mr. Chairman, just
go ahead.
if I may, I just want to take a minute to agree with the ranking member of the Rules Committee. I think the president has shown some restraint. I don't get the sense that the country is moving inexorably towards war, and just question the wisdom of doing this resolution at this time based on the information that we have available. I'm not sure what it accomplishes. We've heard that it's binding, it's not binding. I don't know that any of us really know the answer to that. So I think Mr. Cole's amendment is absolutely appropriate, and I wish we would slow down and give it a little further consideration.
Well, I'm glad the gentleman is at ease about what is happening, but I'm not. And so I would urge my colleagues to vote no on this. All those in favor of the Cole amendment, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole. Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. There are further amendments.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Woodall.
Mr. Chairman, could I just ask a question about number 6 in the rule? It says Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution shall not apply for the remainder of the 116th Congress. I mentioned that the concurrent resolution says the termination of the use of United States Armed Forces engaged in hostilities in Iran, of which there are none, forbid the thought sometime later in 2020 there could be armed forces engaged in hostilities in Iran. Is the function of this rule that we will not take up any more in our effort to reclaim Article 1 authority, that we will not speak to the issue of forces in Iran for the remainder of 2020?
No, I assure you that's not the case. But the rule includes a provision turning off procedures under Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution with respect to Iran. This will not prevent us from taking up any future measures on Iran. It simply is a housekeeping process to prevent automatic floor consideration of redundant measures, similar to what's been done in the past, including this Congress regarding the National Emergency Act and the border wall. So no resolutions have been introduced that would be impacted by it. So this is merely a way to have a more orderly process if other resolutions are introduced.
I recognize, I thank the chairman for his explanation. I recognize the housekeeping necessity of that, given that we've not had any hearing in the Foreign Affairs Committee on this topic. What this in effect means is, as a member, I have no ability. What the War Powers Act would have given me otherwise is the ability to file my concurrent resolution and require that the Committee of Jurisdiction have this conversation and produce this report with their recommendations. With this turned off, having not had any sort of committee jurisdiction conversation, we have now foreclosed that opportunity for me as a rank and file member who shares many of the same concerns you do about.
If you want to introduce a resolution on Iran, we're happy to work with you to get it to through the Foreign Affairs Committee and to the Rules Committee, where we can bring it to the House floor.
I think the gentleman jests, but
No, I'm not.
The gentleman knows I share his concerns about, Mr. Askin referenced presidents aren't usurping power. He's absolutely right. We're giving it away. We just sign up and carry it down there by the wheelbarrow load, and to take what was supposed to be a very thoughtful partnership process. Again, I know the gentleman jests when he says he believes Dr. Burgess is at ease about this. I don't think anybody in this institution is at ease when cruise missiles are flying about the region. What folks are is concerned about what those next steps are. You talk about a miscalculation. What's the miscalculation that the supreme leader in Iran makes with a starkly partisan vote coming out of the U.S. House of Representatives? What is that miscalculation? How would his calculation be different if we produced a resolution that was supported by 430 or 435 members of this institution? You've spent 1 hour, well, that's not true. You've spent 5 minutes with one witness up here from the rank and file decided his idea was good enough that you've now added your name to it, and that got you one Republican vote. What would it have looked like
Hopefully
if
more.
the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who says, I want to be a partner on this, I believe in the War Powers Act, I believe in Article 1, what would it have taken for folks, instead of having gotten the legislation 1 hour before the Rules Committee met and his committee didn't meet at all, what if we'd actually had that conversation? What Ms. Shalala says about cultural sites, reprehensible to speak with that kind of carelessness about something that is so serious and that the United States has spoken out so strongly on when other nations have crossed that red line. How easy it would be for us to come together and speak with one voice on those issues, and we are frittering away that opportunity. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I want to...
Want to have an amendment?
Well, I do want to have
All
an
right,
amendment.
okay.
I don't know what my other options are. At the very least, can we have a motion to recommit added to this? Because the committee does deserve an opportunity to have this conversation. We can do better. While I appreciate what the gentleman has done by adding his name to the Gates Amendment, we can add more Republicans to this bill. We can speak with one voice. We just haven't given it the opportunity. So my amendment to the rule is that the committee provide for one motion to recommit with or without instructions and make the necessary changes.
You heard the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Want a roll call?
Please, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall?
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess?
Aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9
Amendment is
nays.
not agreed to. Further amendments?
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I don't have an amendment, but I still, like Mr. Woodall, I'm a little bit confused by item number 6, that Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution shall not apply during the remainder of the 160.
We can have staff sit down with you after this meeting and
Well,
go through it in
but-
detail if you'd like.
Section 7 simply says, any concurrent resolution introduced shall be referred to the Committee on Foreign Affairs. I mean, why would we turn that off? Why would we,
Well,
why wouldn't we have that? Why wouldn't we keep that as a possibility?
well, I think anything introduced would still be referred to committees.
So why specifically, why did you specifically lift that then in?
Well, if you want to offer an amendment to lift it, you go ahead and do it. We're happy to entertain that motion if you'd like.
I'm just asking you a question for
Yeah,
clarification.
I think I've answered it once, but
It's an
we could sit.
statement that you.
No, it's not
in the
unusual,
rule.
right. It's not unusual. It's been done before. But if the gentleman would like to offer an amendment to lift it, we're more than happy to entertain it.
Well, I don't have anything written out, but I'd offer an
Well, we
amendment
could-
that
we
we
could- you
strike
can
section
go a
6
cappella. We can-
of the rule.
All right. Any further amendments? What?
Well, I just don't understand.
Well, if he wants to strike section 2, that's fine. Yeah. Excuse me, we're in a... Does the gentleman want to strike section 2? I heard that. St. Jude for the hopeless cases. Yeah. All right, all right. All right, I appreciate it. All right.
we would have.
Yeah,
And I think the Committee of Jurisdiction should remain front and center on this, and eliminating that possibility with what you're doing here, I think is an error. So I'm probably going to vote against your rule.
Yeah. So I would just say, yeah, but let me just remind, when the judge becomes president, I would remind him in the last Congress, my friends here turned off the War Powers Act without giving Mr. Khanna a vote. We are voting on an Iran War Powers resolution. So when we talk about precedent, my friends set a bad precedent, which is they turned off the War Powers Act and allowed nothing to be voted on. We're not doing that here. Okay, no further amendments. The vote is now on the motion from the gentleman from Florida. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin. Aye. Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, aye. Ms. Shalala. Ms. Shalala, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Mr. Cole. No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Clerk,
aye.
report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
Motion is agreed to, and I will handle it for the Democrats.
Mr. Burgess will manage.
Okay, no other business. The Rules Committee is adjourned.